The golden hues of sunset slowly vanished, the quiet of the evening enveloping the neighborhood as Thomas's car rolled down the familiar street. After a week away, he was eager to be home. As he turned into his driveway, his thoughts lingered on his wife, Madison. They planned a night together, just them, no work, no distractions. He imagined her waiting for him, maybe already prepping something for dinner. It would be a warm, quiet homecoming. But then he saw it. Parked brazenly in front of his house was his brother's car. Thomas's brow furrowed. Why would George be here, especially when he knew Thomas was returning tonight? He stepped out, confusion turning into an unease that settled like a heavy weight in his chest. Just then, he noticed a figure leaning against the car, casually waiting. George looked up, a grin spreading across his face. He lifted a hand in greeting, not moving from his spot. "Hey, man," he said, his tone too casual. Thomas approached, sensing something off in the way George's eyes sparkled with mischief. Before he could ask what George was doing there, George's words hit him like a slap. "Just dropping off your sexy wife after a long, wild night together." Thomas froze, his mind struggling to comprehend what George had just said. The words replayed in his head, each one twisting deeper. "Wild night?" His stomach churned. "Excuse me?" Thomas's voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but the anger beneath was unmistakable. George's grin widened, eyes glinting with something almost cruel. He glanced toward the house, then pointed up to the bedroom window. "She's up there now," he continued, his voice taunting. "Getting ready for round two. You can't do anything, loser." Thomas felt the ground tilt beneath him. His heart pounded, and his hands clenched. This had to be some twisted joke. He opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but George cut him off. "Oh, and don't worry," George added, voice dripping with mockery. "I left you a little gift. Check your safe." He crossed his arms, smirking as if relishing Thomas's growing disbelief. Silence fell as Thomas stared, struggling to hold back the wave of fury surging through him. This wasn't real. This couldn't be. And yet, there was George, not a hint of shame or regret in his face. A strange calm overtook Thomas, and without another word, he lunged, grabbing George by the collar and twisting his wrist in a vice-like grip. George's smirk vanished, replaced by a grimace of pain. He fell to his knees, his hand caught painfully in Thomas's grip. "Let go!" he shouted, his voice laced with panic, but Thomas only tightened his hold, his eyes dark with rage. "You think this is funny?" Thomas growled, voice steady. "You come to my house, saying you were with my wife, and you think this is funny?" George tried to pull his wrist free, gasping. "Come on, man. You don't have it in you to go through with this. You're not strong enough for what it takes." Thomas tightened his grip even further, ignoring the sound of George's pained breaths. The calm was gone, replaced by the scorching anger he could no longer contain. "Strong enough?" Thomas's voice was sharp, each word laced with venom. "You took my trust, George, my marriage. You went after Madison, my wife. And you think I won't make you regret this?" George finally twisted free, stumbling back and rubbing his wrist, his smugness replaced by something else, perhaps a flicker of fear. He opened his mouth, but whatever he planned to say was drowned in Thomas's next words. "Get out," Thomas hissed, stepping closer. "Get out, or you'll be the one begging." His voice was barely controlled, every inch of him coiled in barely restrained fury. George hesitated, glancing from his brother to the house, but Thomas's cold, unforgiving glare left no room for argument. George raised his hands, taking a step back toward his car. "Fine, I'm going," he said, a shadow of his former arrogance lingering in his tone. "But remember, you brought this on yourself." He climbed into his car and sped off, his parting words lost to the roar of the engine. Thomas watched the car disappear, his heart pounding. The fury burned, but beneath it lay a raw, aching wound. His thoughts turned to Madison. He'd trusted her, believed in her. Yet, if George's words held any truth, that trust had been shattered. Every memory, every moment they'd shared suddenly felt tainted, a cruel mockery of what he thought was real. Thomas shut the front door behind him quietly, The house eerily silent except for Madison's soft humming from upstairs. The familiar tune hit him like a cruel joke that she could carry on as if nothing had happened while his world splintered apart. But he wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. He needed to see it for himself. He made his way to the office, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. He'd never had cause to doubt Madison, not even a reason to question her loyalty. Yet now he found himself staring down at the safe in the corner, a small fortress for secrets he'd never thought would haunt his life. His fingers shook as he punched in the code, every beat sounding louder than the last. He took a breath, steadying himself, then pulled the safe door open. Inside was a manila envelope, barely larger than his hand. George's handwriting scrawled across it in black ink, mocking him proof. Thomas gritted his teeth and opened the envelope. The photographs spilled into his hand, each one a damning testament to what he feared most. He didn't need to examine them long. One glance at the first was enough to make his heart drop. Madison and George. Her head on his shoulder, her hand resting casually on his knee, her laughter frozen in the moment. He flipped through them, each more painful than the last. The two of them in places that had once been sacred to him and Madison, their favorite beach, a cozy corner of their favorite restaurant, the back deck where he'd spent so many evenings with her, just talking under the stars. The final photo made him pause, a flash of bile rising in his throat. George was kissing her, his hand cradling her face as though she was something precious, something his. Thomas could almost hear Madison's soft giggle, the same one that used to be just for him. He gripped the edge of the photograph, his knuckles white, feeling the sting of betrayal cut deep. As he slid the photos back into the envelope, a dark resolve settled within him. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a mockery of everything he'd believed in, everything he'd built with her. This wouldn't go unanswered. He shoved the safe shut, the bang echoing in the silent room. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, letting the anger seep through every part of him. Finally, he turned and headed upstairs. He'd avoided her long enough. As he reached the bedroom door, he paused, his hand hovering just above the doorknob. He could hear her moving around, the gentle creak of the bed as she shifted, perhaps getting comfortable as she waited for him. For a split second, he almost walked away, but the images from the envelope were still fresh in his mind, a twisted reminder of what he'd seen. Thomas pushed the bedroom door open with enough force that it hit the wall, and Madison's head snapped up. She was lounging on the bed, one hand lazily scrolling through her phone. Her face went pale the instant she saw him, and her hand froze. "Thomas, you're home? Early?" Her voice cracked, and her eyes darted between him and the doorway as if searching for an escape. He could practically see the gears turning in her mind. "Yeah." He took a step inside, letting the silence stretch out until her panic was nearly palpable. "Earlier than expected," he said, voice steady and cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph, tossing it onto the bed in front of her. "You want to explain this?" Madison's hand shook as she picked it up, her face blanching. Thomas, I can explain," she stammered, her eyes wide, searching his face for any trace of forgiveness. It was a mistake. I was lonely, and he was just there." She gripped the photo tightly as if trying to erase the image by sheer will. "Please, you have to believe me. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a bitterness that seemed to seep from somewhere deep inside. "You did more than hurt me, Madison. You broke everything. Everything we built, everything we stood for. With my own brother." He shook his head, disbelief evident on his face. "Was nothing sacred to you?" She shook her head vigorously, inching toward him on the bed, but he took a step back, crossing his arms. "Thomas, I know I messed up. I was weak, and he took advantage of that. Don't put this on him." His voice was sharp, cutting through her excuses. "You made the choice, Madison. You chose him. You let him into our life, into our bed. And you want me to believe you were just lonely?" Her eyes filled with tears, her voice desperate. "Please, Thomas. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about him. It was just me being stupid. I love you, not him. I'll do anything to fix this." "Fix this?" He looked at her incredulously, a harsh laugh escaping him. You think this can be fixed? That we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend everything's okay? Madison's lip trembled, her voice barely more than a whisper. Thomas, please, give me a chance. Let me prove to you that this was a mistake, one that will never happen again. Thomas stared at her, his jaw clenched. Every plea, every tear felt rehearsed, as though she'd planned her words for a moment like this. So, that's it, he asked, voice cold. You think you could throw some words at me and everything will go back to the way it was? She reached for his hand, but he pulled back, his glare sharp enough to stop her. I'll go to counseling, she said quickly, desperation creeping into her tone. I'll do anything to make this right, Thomas. Please, we can get through this. We've been through so much already. Thomas clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. No, Madison. I went through things for us. I was gone for work, trying to build a future for both of us. And while I was gone, you were here with him. You weren't thinking about us. You were thinking about yourself. Thomas, that's not fair. Madison snapped, her voice cracking under the pressure. You left me alone so many times. I was lonely. I needed someone. He looked at her with contempt. So that makes it okay. You think loneliness justifies betrayal? Her shoulders sagged, and she looked down, her hands shaking as they clutched the photograph. No, it doesn't. I know that. But I thought you'd understand that I was only human, that I could make mistakes. She met his gaze, pleading. I need you to understand. What I understand, he replied icily, is that you chose to break every ounce of trust one ever placed in you. You chose him over me. Madison choked back a sob, standing to meet him, reaching for his arm. Thomas, please. I don't want to lose you. You're my husband, my everything. We've been through so much together. You can't just throw it all away. No, Thomas's voice was calm, but his eyes were dark, unreadable. You threw it all away, Madison. Not me. He took a breath, his expression cold. Do you have any idea what it feels like to see this? He snatched the photograph back from her, holding it up. To know that the person I gave my life to, the person I trusted most, was betraying me under my own roof. She reached out, grabbing his arm desperately. Please don't end us over this. It was one mistake. I'll prove it to you. I'll make it right. He shook her hand off. There's no making this right. What we had is gone. You destroyed it. Tears streamed down her face, and she fell to her knees, clutching his hand. Thomas, I'll do anything. Just don't walk away. He looked down at her, anger and bitterness twisting in his expression. Do you even understand what you're asking of me? After all of this? To look at you every day and remember that you chose him. She sobbed, clutching his hand tighter. I made a horrible mistake, Thomas. But I can't lose you. I won't survive it. Thomas pulled his hand free, stepping back, disgust and fury etched into his face. Survive it? You want sympathy from me? After what you did? Madison nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper. I want us back. He shook his head slowly. There is no us anymore, Madison. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought I had, doesn't exist. You killed it when you betrayed me. Please. Madison's voice was hoarse, breaking on the word. He looked at her, his face cold, unmoved. I'm done, Madison. I'm done giving you chances. And I'm done letting you make excuses. You can cry all you want. You're on your own. He turned and walked toward the door, her voice rising in a desperate cry behind him. Thomas, don't leave. Please. I'll do anything. But he didn't turn back. Not this time. Thomas waited in silence, watching Madison from a distance. Her desperation grew each day, her pleas sounding hollow in his ears. At first, she tried apologies, then tears, but every attempt was met with the same cold, silent dismissal. He let her feel his absence even in his presence, her once-beloved husband now a ghost she couldn't reach. One evening, Thomas decided it was time to face George directly. He drove to a rundown bar on the edge of town, a place George frequented, and waited in the shadows. George's smug face popped up in the dim light of the parking lot as he swaggered toward his car, unaware of Thomas until he was close enough to touch. George! Thomas's voice cut through the air, low and cold. George turned, momentarily surprised but quickly recovering his cocky smile. Well, look who finally showed up. Come to cry some more, brother? Thomas's gaze didn't waver. You took from me. You'll feel what it's like to lose everything. George scoffed, rolling his eyes, waving dismissively. Save the drama, Thomas. Madison made her choice. Get over it. But Thomas's steady glare didn't falter, and for the first time, George's smirk slipped. Oh, you're serious? He asked, chuckling nervously. You're right, Thomas said calmly. Stepping closer, Madison made her choice. But you may want to, George. You knew what this would do to me. George's smile faded, his bravado replaced by a flicker of unease. So what? You're gonna scare me? Come on, man. You're not that guy. Thomas tilted his head, his expression dark. You don't know me as well as you think, George. Without another word, Thomas turned on his heel and left, leaving George staring after him, uncertain and slightly rattled. But that was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Thomas started to execute his plan with meticulous patience. George had built a life that looked solid on the surface, but he'd cut corners, made enemies, and kept secrets. Thomas knew exactly where to hit. The first strike came subtly. Thomas dug into George's financials, using old contacts from his business to uncover debts George had hidden from everyone. Late one night, George's phone rang. Mr. Evans, this is an urgent notice about your account. You've defaulted on 3 loans, and unless we see immediate payment, we'll be forced to seize your assets. George's eyes widened, his voice shaking as he fumbled for an excuse. What? No, there's got to be some mistake. I have everything under control. The caller didn't respond to his pleas. By the time the call ended, George was sweating, pacing his apartment as he tried to make sense of the sudden financial chaos. But it was only the beginning. The next week, Thomas paid a visit to an old acquaintance, someone he knew George had betrayed years ago. I think I can help you with something, Thomas said, sliding a file across the table. If you're interested in evening the score. The man's eyes lit up as he looked over the file. He left me in the dust, and now you want to help take him down? What's in it for you? Just the satisfaction of watching him fall, Thomas replied, his voice calm. That's all I need. With that small push, rumors started to spread. Associates began to question George's integrity. Suddenly, business deals he'd relied on were canceled, clients withdrew, and George's network began to crumble around him. Each night, Thomas would watch from the shadows, observing George's life deteriorate piece by piece. Meanwhile, Madison's desperation grew. She'd watched Thomas slip away, his eyes cold, his words clipped, her once loving husband now unreachable. She had tried pleading, begging for forgiveness, even attempting to bargain, but he'd only responded with silence. Each night, she sat in their empty bed, the loneliness gnawing at her, the weight of guilt crushing her. Thomas barely came home, and when he did, he slept in the guest room, leaving her to stare at the ceiling, wondering if he'd ever forgive her. One evening, while Madison sat alone, George showed up, his face pale, eyes filled with anger and desperation. You need to fix this, he snapped, barging into her living room. You know he's behind all this, right? My money, my clients, they're all bailing on me. He's ruining me, Madison. She looked at him, her eyes bloodshot, her face drawn and tired. What do you expect me to do, George? You're the one who couldn't keep this a secret. Oh, so this is my fault now? George spat. You think you're innocent here? You wanted this, Madison. You're just as guilty as I am. Madison's face crumpled, and she shook her head. I thought he'd understand. I didn't realize it would come to this. George's expression twisted in anger and desperation. Then you better figure out how to fix it. I'm not losing everything over this. Thomas appeared in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. His voice cut through the room like a knife. You're both getting what you deserve. George spun around, his face flashing with rage. You think this is over, Thomas? You can't ruin me and expect me to just roll over. I'll fight back. But Thomas stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. Fight back? You've already lost, George. You just don't know it yet. George clenched his fists, breathing heavily, his anger mounting. You don't get to do this to me. You don't get to take everything from me, just because you're hurt." Thomas let out a humorless laugh. "Everything? You took my family, my trust. You betrayed me and destroyed a marriage that meant everything to me. This is just the consequences catching up with you." Madison stepped forward, her voice shaky. "Thomas, please, we can end this. Let's just try to move past it. I'll leave. I'll give you space, whatever you need. But this has to stop." He looked at her, his face devoid of sympathy. "Move past it? You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." George's face twisted in anger, and he lunged at Thomas, fists swinging. But Thomas was ready. He sidestepped, grabbing George by the arm and twisting it behind his back, forcing him down. George grunted in pain, struggling to break free. "You think this makes you a man, Thomas? Hurting your own brother?" Thomas tightened his grip, his voice low and steady. "A man doesn't betray his family. A man doesn't destroy someone's life for his own selfish gain. You stopped being my brother the second you went after my wife." Madison stood frozen, watching the brothers, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. "Thomas, stop, please. This has gone too far." Thomas released George, letting him stumble to his feet. He looked at both of them, his face hard. "I'm done. I've taken everything you valued, George, just like you took everything from me. And now, you can both figure out how to live with yourselves." George glared at him, rage and defeat warring in his expression, but he knew he'd lost. Madison choked back a sob, reaching for Thomas, but he brushed past her without a glance, leaving them both to face the ruins they'd created. Madison could barely recognize herself anymore. Days blurred together, each one worse than the last. Her life, once built on stability and comfort, was now a series of empty hours filled with dread and regret. Her mind circled back to Thomas, to the love she'd shattered, and each reminder tightened the weight in her chest. She barely saw him anymore. When he came home, he would pass her as if she was a stranger, his eyes fixed forward, his silence more cutting than any words. One evening, she couldn't take it any longer. She called her friend Leah, someone she'd confided in during happier days. Leah picked up, her tone wary. "Hey, Leah, I need someone to talk to," Madison whispered, her voice trembling. There was a pause on the line before Leah replied, her voice cold. "I don't think that's a good idea, Madison." Madison's heart sank, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. "Please, Leah, I know I messed up, but can we just talk? I'm falling apart over here." Leah sighed. "Madison, everyone knows what happened. Do you know how many people are hurt by this? Thomas was your husband, your family, and you went behind his back with his own brother. Do you think anyone wants to be associated with that?" Madison felt the tears spill over, her grip on the phone tightening. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. It was a mistake." "Then you'll have to live with it, Madison," Leah replied flatly. "I have to go. Good luck." And with that, Leah hung up, leaving Madison alone in the silence. As the weeks went on, the isolation only deepened. People who once greeted her with warmth now avoided her, their whispers trailing behind her wherever she went. Even at the grocery store, familiar faces turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. The shame was suffocating, and there was no escape. One afternoon, Madison tried to reach out to her family. She called her mother, hoping for some reassurance, for some kind of solace. Her mother's voice was firm, lacking its usual warmth. "Madison, what were you thinking?" I don't know," Madison stammered, the words coming out choked. "Mom, I don't know how to make it right. I'm lost." Her mother sighed. "Madison, you were given everything you needed. You had a loving husband, a stable life. And you threw it all away for what exactly?" "Mom, please." Madison's voice broke, her hands shaking. "I made a mistake, but can't you just be there for me? Just this once?" "I am here, Madison, but I can't support what you did. I can't understand why you would do something so thoughtless, so selfish." Her mother's voice was tinged with sadness. "You'll have to figure this out on your own." Madison ended the call, her heart feeling heavier than ever. She sank onto the couch, wrapping her arms around herself, as if she could hold herself together. Each failed attempt at finding support chipped away at her, and each time she saw Thomas at home, his silent, cold gaze was enough to shatter her even further. One evening, she saw him come home after a long day. She approached him, her heart pounding. "Thomas, can we talk?" He didn't stop, didn't even look at her as he shrugged off his coat and made his way to the guest room. She followed him, desperate. "Thomas, please. I know you're angry. I know I messed up, but can't you at least talk to me?" He finally turned, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "What do you want me to say, Madison? I just want you to see that I'm sorry, that I'm falling apart. I miss you, Thomas. I miss us." He let out a bitter laugh, his eyes hard. "You miss me? You miss what we had? You're the one who destroyed it, Madison. You think I could just look at you, hear your apologies, and suddenly forget everything you did?" She reached out, her hand shaking as she tried to touch his arm. He pulled back, and the rejection burned. "I know I can't fix this, but I don't know how to live like this, Thomas. I don't know how to live without you. You should have thought about that before you went behind my back. You thought you'd get away with it? That you could just smile at me and pretend it never happened?" Madison broke down, covering her face with her hands as sobs racked her body. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I thought I could handle it, that it didn't matter. But it does, Thomas. It matters more than anything." Thomas watched her, his expression stony. "You'll have to figure out how to handle it, Madison. Because I'm done." He walked past her, leaving her in the empty hallway, her cries echoing through the silence. In the following days, Madison felt her life unravel further. Her job, her last semblance of normalcy, was slipping too. Word of her affair had spread through the office, and she could feel the judgmental stares of her colleagues as she passed. Her boss, once supportive and friendly, now kept their conversations short and professional, with an edge of impatience. One day, she was called into the office. She sat across from her boss, his face neutral as he handed her a letter. "Madison, I think you're aware that your performance has been slipping." She nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. "We're going to have to let you go," he continued. "I think it's best for both of us if you take some time to focus on your personal situation." Madison left the office in a daze, clutching the letter as if it would somehow tether her to reality. She sat in her car, staring blankly at the dashboard. Everything she'd built, everything she thought she could count on was gone. By the time she returned home, the weight of it all was crushing her. She stumbled through the door, tears streaming down her face. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. She found herself looking around the empty house, the rooms filled with memories of happier times. Her gaze settled on a photo of her and Thomas on their wedding day, their faces lit with joy. She picked it up, tracing his face with her fingertip, her heart aching with regret. She had taken it all for granted, and now she had nothing left. In the quiet, she heard the door open. Thomas entered, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of her, broken and defeated. She moved toward him, the photo still in her hand, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Thomas, please. Can we try again? I can't do this alone." He looked at her, his face devoid of the warmth that had once been there. "Madison, I don't owe you anything." "I know," she whispered, the tears spilling over once more. "But I'm begging you." His gaze was unyielding, and after a moment he shook his head. "This is your mess, Madison. You're on your own." She watched him turn and walk away, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty house. And as the silence swallowed her whole, Madison realized that the life she once had, the happiness she'd taken for granted, was truly gone. The seasons had shifted by the time Thomas felt even a glimmer of real peace. Months had passed since the shock of Madison's betrayal, and though the anger and hurt had faded to a dull ache, Thomas knew he wasn't the same man he'd been before. He'd spent those months alone, finding his footing, learning who he was without the weight of a broken marriage dragging him down. Then, one Friday evening, he found himself at a friend's small dinner gathering. He'd come reluctantly, encouraged by his friend Alex, who insisted he needed to get out of the house and meet new people. Thomas wasn't sure he was ready for any of that yet, but Alex could be persistent. Halfway through the night, as Thomas was refilling his glass, he noticed a woman sitting alone at the far end of the backyard, looking thoughtfully at the stars. There was a quiet ease to her, a peacefulness that seemed unaffected by the noise of laughter and conversation around them. Intrigued, he wandered over. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a warm, understanding smile. "Of course not," she replied, motioning to the empty chair beside her. "I could use the company. I'm Isabel, by the way." "Thomas." He offered a small smile, feeling the slightest pull of curiosity that he hadn't felt in a long time. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both watching the stars. Finally, Isabel broke the silence. "I'm guessing you didn't really want to be here tonight either," she said, glancing at him with a knowing smile. Thomas chuckled. "You're right. I was dragged out by a friend who claims I need to get back out there." He shrugged. "But I'm not really looking to be anywhere." Isabel nodded. "I understand. I've been there myself. Sometimes you just need time to sit with everything. No rush to move on or prove something." Her words resonated with Thomas. "You sound like someone who's been through her own storms." Isabel nodded, her face softening as memories flickered across her expression. "A marriage that ended with betrayal," she said quietly. "I learned a lot about myself, about trust, and about forgiveness. But it took time." Their conversation unfolded easily after that, touching on everything from their families to favorite books. Isabel had a gentle honesty about her that Thomas found refreshing. She didn't pry into his past, but somehow knew just the right questions to ask, allowing him to share what he felt comfortable with. For the first time in months, Thomas felt his guard dropping. "Do you think it's possible to truly trust again?" he asked at one point, surprising himself with the vulnerability in his voice. Isabel looked thoughtful. "I think it's possible, but it's not the same as before. Trust changes. It becomes more cautious, more guarded. But if you find someone who respects that, someone who understands why you're cautious, then yes, I think it's possible." Thomas nodded, absorbing her words. "I never thought I'd find myself sitting here, talking to someone about this, let alone someone who actually understands." Isabel gave him a small smile. "I didn't either. But life has a funny way of bringing people together when they least expect it." As the night wore on, Thomas and Isabel exchanged numbers, and when they parted ways, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Isabel started meeting for coffee, walks in the park, and the occasional dinner. Each time, Thomas felt himself letting go of the bitterness and hurt he'd held on to. Isabel never pushed him, never tried to fix him. Instead, she listened, offering quiet comfort and understanding. One afternoon, they met at a small bookstore they'd both mentioned wanting to explore. As they browsed, Thomas picked up a novel and leafed through the pages absent-mindedly. "Have you read this one?" Isabel asked, glancing at the book in his hands. He shook his head. "No, but I hear it's good. It's supposed to be about second chances." She raised an eyebrow. "Fitting, isn't it?" Thomas smiled, nodding. "Yeah, I guess it is." They left the bookstore and took a walk by the nearby river, the sun casting golden reflections on the water. The silence between them was comfortable, and Thomas felt a rare sense of peace. After a while, he turned to her. "You know, I didn't think I could ever trust anyone again," he admitted. "But somehow, being with you, it feels different." Isabel met his gaze, her expression sincere. "Thomas, I felt the same way. When you go through something like what we both did, it changes you. But that doesn't mean we're broken." Thomas took her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers against his. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being patient with me, for understanding." She squeezed his hand gently. "I think we're both learning what it means to start over. We don't have to rush, Thomas. We have time." Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, without the urgency or desperation that Thomas had once felt. He found himself laughing more, feeling lighter with each day that passed. With Isabel, he discovered a type of love that was steady and comforting, untainted by the betrayals of the past. One evening, as they sat together in her small living room, Isabel rested her head on his shoulder. "Have you ever thought about what's next for you?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded. "I have actually. For the first time in a long time, I'm thinking about what I want, not just what I'm trying to move away from." He paused. "And I'd like you to be part of it." Isabel looked up, her eyes shining. "I like that too." They sat in silence, the weight of their past fading as they looked toward a future that felt hopeful and real. Thomas knew he'd never forget the pain Madison and George had caused him. But with Isabel, he'd found someone who reminded him that life could be more than betrayal, more than loss. In time, Thomas felt not only that he had healed, but that he had grown. He realized that his experiences, painful as they were, had led him to someone who valued him, someone who respected the journey he'd been on and was willing to walk with him into whatever came next. He leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to Isabel's forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. Isabel smiled, her hand resting on his. "Thank you for trusting me." And as they sat together, surrounded by the quiet comfort of the evening, Thomas knew he had finally found a new beginning. Years slipped by, and the damage caused by Madison and George's betrayal only grew. What had once seemed thrilling, a secret affair, the thrill of breaking boundaries, had transformed into bitterness and isolation. While Thomas rebuilt his life, Madison and George remained bound by the repercussions of their actions, haunted by the choices they'd made and the life they'd thrown away. Madison's life had changed drastically since she lost Thomas. She tried to convince herself that she'd moved on, yet in quiet moments, the truth gnawed at her. She'd lost friends, her family grew distant, and whispers of her affair followed her everywhere. Even small errands brought painful reminders. Neighbors who avoided her gaze, acquaintances who no longer returned her calls, and co-workers who, when they thought she wasn't listening, gossiped about her fall from grace. One rainy afternoon, Madison sat in her small, cluttered apartment, staring blankly out the window. Her mind wandered back to her life with Thomas, their cozy evenings, shared laughter, and plans for the future. She thought of the quiet strength he'd had, the kindness that seemed so constant, something she'd once taken for granted. She picked up her phone and, almost on impulse, dialed his number, her heart racing with each ring. The call went unanswered, as she knew it would. She sat there, her hands trembling, feeling the full weight of what she'd thrown away. Setting the phone down, she whispered to herself, "I'm sorry, Thomas. I really am." Meanwhile, George's life had also unraveled. The day Thomas exposed him had been a swift, brutal fall from grace. His social circle, once filled with people who admired him, had turned its back. Friends distanced themselves, and even his career took a hit as rumors spread about his disloyalty. He went through the motions, trying to pick up the pieces, but he knew there was no escaping the consequences of his choices. One evening, George met Madison at a quiet bar. She sat at a corner table, nursing a drink, her expression hollow and tired. When George arrived, he forced a smile, but she barely acknowledged him. "Hey, Madison," he greeted, taking a seat across from her. How have you been?" She looked up at him, her eyes dull. "How do you think?" Her voice was bitter, carrying the weight of years of regret. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. It's hard, but we still have each other, don't we?" Madison scoffed. "Each other? That's all we have left. And look where it's gotten us." She looked around the bar, her gaze distant. "Sometimes I think about how different things would be if we'd never," George's face darkened. "What's done is done, Madison. Regretting it now won't change anything. But don't you feel it, George? Don't you feel the emptiness, the regret? We destroyed everything for this." She gestured between them, her voice thick with frustration. "And for what? A few fleeting moments? We had it all, and we let it slip through our fingers." George clenched his jaw. He hated hearing the resentment in her voice, but he couldn't deny it. The consequences of their betrayal weren't just the loss of their relationships or reputations. It was the realization that they were bound together, trapped in a shared guilt that neither of them could escape. After a strained silence, he finally spoke. "You're right. I think about it too. But we can't go back, Madison. All we can do is move forward, somehow." Madison shook her head. "Forward to what, George? What future do we even have now?" She finished her drink and stood up, her expression empty. "We lost everything, and we have no one to blame but ourselves." She left him sitting there, staring down at the empty glass in his hands. He knew Madison was right, but facing that truth felt unbearable. There was no escaping the fact that they were living in the wreckage of their own choices. Meanwhile, Thomas's life had grown into something he could finally cherish. He had met Isabel, a woman who brought him more peace and companionship than he had ever imagined. Their bond, built on patience and mutual understanding, flourished over the years. They shared a modest home, filled with warmth and laughter, and Isabel had become his steadfast partner in every sense. One weekend, Thomas and Isabel took a stroll through the neighborhood park, their hands intertwined. They stopped at a small bench near a lake, watching the ducks swim in the late afternoon sun. Isabel smiled up at him. Hard to believe how much has changed over the years, isn't it? Thomas nodded. Yeah, looking back, I never thought I'd be able to find peace again. He turned to her, squeezing her hand. But with you, I've learned to trust again. I've learned to let go of the past. She rested her head on his shoulder. That's all I ever wanted for you. To find happiness, even if it meant leaving everything behind. They sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of the past no longer as heavy as it once had been. Thomas felt an immense gratitude for the journey that had brought him here, to this moment of quiet contentment. Back in her lonely apartment, Madison watched from afar, aware of Thomas's newfound happiness. She heard from mutual friends how he'd moved on, how he'd found someone who truly valued him. Every piece of news felt like a fresh blow, a reminder of what she'd lost and would never regain. She saw photos of him with Isabel, laughing, happy, images that burned in her mind as she lay awake at night. In one last desperate attempt, she sent him a message, a simple text asking if they could talk, hoping for some form of closure, a chance to make amends. Hours passed with no reply, and as the reality settled in, she finally understood that forgiveness wasn't hers to claim. She had missed her chance, and Thomas was no longer within her reach. Thomas, seeing the message later, quietly deleted it. He'd moved on, and he wasn't about to reopen old wounds. He owed it to himself and to Isabel to let go of that chapter completely. Years later, Thomas's happiness stood as a stark contrast to the lives Madison and George now led, lives shaped by regret, bound by mistakes they couldn't undo. While Thomas moved forward, they remained haunted by the consequences of their choices, left only with the shadows of a life they'd shattered and could never reclaim. The morning sun peeked through the window as Thomas sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming his hands. He looked out at the quiet, tree-lined street. The years since Madison's betrayal had been long and turbulent, but here he was at peace, perhaps for the first time. There was no more bitterness, no more anger. He had let it all go, leaving him lighter than he'd ever felt before. As he sipped his coffee, Isabel walked in, her hair slightly tousled from sleep, a soft smile on her face. She poured herself a cup and joined him at the table, her presence grounding him in a way that was both calming and comforting. "Good morning," she murmured, reaching over to rest her hand on his. "Morning," he replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. She studied him for a moment, picking up on the sense of quiet satisfaction radiating from him. "You look, I don't know, different today. Peaceful." Thomas chuckled softly, nodding. "I was just thinking about everything I've been through. How it all feels like a distant memory now." He looked down, tracing his fingers along the rim of his mug. "It's strange. For so long, I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again." Isabel squeezed his hand, her eyes warm. "You've come a long way, Thomas. I know how much pain you went through, how hard it was to trust again." She hesitated, then added, "You've shown me that love can be rebuilt, even after it's been broken." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the street outside. Memories of the betrayal, the anger, and the sadness surfaced briefly, like ripples on the surface of still water. But now, they were just that, ripples. Nothing that could shake him anymore. After breakfast, Thomas decided to visit a quiet spot by the lake, a place he used to go when he needed to clear his mind. As he walked the familiar path, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The betrayal he'd once thought he could never overcome had become part of the foundation of who he was, shaping him, but no longer defining him. Sitting by the lake, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his old photos. One picture caught his eye, It was a candid shot of him and Madison at a friend's wedding, back when he thought their love was unbreakable. For a brief moment, he felt a pang, not for the person Madison had become, but for the dream they'd once shared, the life they'd once planned. He took a deep breath, then deleted the picture, a final act of closure. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, leaning back against a tree as he closed his eyes, feeling a sense of liberation washing over him. He learned the hard way that some people aren't meant to stay, and that some love stories are meant to end. What mattered was the growth that followed, the person he'd become in the aftermath. As he stood up, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was Isabel, asking if he'd like to meet her for lunch. A smile broke across his face as he replied, "I'd love to. I'm on my way." When he met Isabel at a small, cozy cafe downtown, he felt a warmth in his heart, a lightness that had taken him years to find. She greeted him with an embrace, and as they sat down together, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Over their meal, they talked about their plans for the future, travel ideas, dreams of buying a small house by the coast, maybe even starting a family someday. Isabel looked at him, her eyes bright with hope and excitement. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Thomas leaned back, looking at her thoughtfully. "I do. I think about how I never thought I'd make it through, never thought I'd find someone like you." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You've shown me that love can be simple, kind, something that doesn't have to hurt." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of the past finally feeling like it had been left where it belonged, behind him. He realized that Isabel was more than just a new love. She was a reminder of the strength he'd discovered within himself. As they finished lunch and strolled through the park hand in hand, Thomas felt a quiet sense of gratitude for the life he now had. The pain he'd endured had once felt unbearable, but now it felt like a bridge, something he'd crossed to find this new chapter. His past had not defined him, but it had refined him, shaping him into someone stronger, someone who could love with his whole heart, unburdened by fear or regret. Later that evening, as Thomas and Isabel curled up on the couch, a sense of contentment settled over him. He looked over at her, feeling a deep sense of peace, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. For the first time, he understood that some endings were just the beginning of something new, something better. And as they sat there, wrapped in each other's presence, Thomas finally felt whole again.